I'm Rene Ritchie. I work as a tech analyst.
I'm Georgia Dow. I'm a psychotherapist and do podcasts.
And this is Apple Talk, where we talk about Apple and related companies and how they affect our culture and our lives.
So Rene, where are we starting off today?
So, true confession, our original podcast, our original pilot for this podcast was all about
3 times.
Yeah, it was all about the antitrust hearings, and we didn't get audio for it.
No, it was really good.
Yeah, it was so good it would have been used in the final report for the antitrust filings.
Maybe not that good.
It was probably that good.
Probably that good.
But it doesn't exist anymore. So now the report has come out. They've issued their verdict. Not their verdict. They've issued their report. They're telling us what they think, how they think these companies have wronged us. And I figured we'd start with Apple because that's our focus.
Okay. Well, how has Apple wronged us?
So it's interesting because going into these hearings, I did not understand them. And the US and the EU, there's like these two different entities that try to govern and regulate anti-competitive behavior. And with the EU, it's all about increasing competition. Like they just want to make sure that there's a lot of different consumer choice on the market.
Right.
But in the US, it's mostly about preventing consumer harm. And they tend to do that by wanting prices to be as low as possible.
Right.
So, and there's just a lot of comedy that results in all of these things. So you have the Department of Justice in the US, the Federal Trade Commission, but in this case, it's the US Congress. And it reminds me of that West Wing joke where if you want to just stall a process, make it as cockamamie as possible, have it just a bunch of yelling, seething, bipartisan, chaos, that sounds like a job for the US Congress.
But how do you think that Congress did in this case with asking questions and, going through it and kind of trying to sort, because this is not an easy subject to go through, right? What does it even mean? What does antitrust mean? You have to define everything and go through it. What are your basic thoughts before you go through what happened beforehand?
I think it was absolutely ridiculous. I think it was completely tech illiterate and it was a complete dumpster fire. I did have problems initially with them going in by calling in all these 4 companies at once, handling them at once, because they're so different. Apple and Facebook and Google and Amazon have such fundamentally different, there's a lot of overlap between some of them, but not all of them.
Right.
And I did think that they initially made they surprised me. They surprised me and they disappointed me. And the long or the short of it is, I think the charges they laid out in the beginning, they did not prove at all. They didn't even try to. The charges they set aside in the beginning, they didn't even argue those. What they did do is make a compelling case that all of these companies abuse their competitors and their partners.
They use the power of which they have to be able to control,
push
dictate,
around.
find information to it. And the interesting thing is that they actually had receipts. So they actually went through internal emails that, they would ask the question, then when, one of the heads would say, I'm not really sure about that, then they would say, well, we have this email of you stating these exact same things. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, which I thought was actually pretty good, that they, at least this time, they brought the receipts.
Yeah, no, I think that part was great. It didn't match with what they were accusing them of in the beginning. Right. And then at the end, they just gavelled it and said, okay, we're going to break you all up, which had nothing to do with either what they were accusing them of in the beginning or the behavior that they identified successfully in the middle part of it.
Right.
Because Congress.
Yeah, it's lots of people that get a very short amount of time to be able to deal with something, and then they're interviewing 4 of the biggest tech companies, which most of their answers were, I don't really know, I don't do this. And then they as they should, push kind of their, whatever's their dialogue of press that they want to send out to the world.
Their sound bites,
Yeah.
So for Apple in specific, I think it's fair to say that absolutely everything they're criticizing Apple about involves the App Store. As far as I could tell, while they're investigating Google and Amazon and Facebook for a bunch of other things, Apple seemed entirely focused on the App Store.
Right. And the arbitrary way in which they enforce their rules of the App Store.
Yeah. And what was tough for me to see is in the very beginning, Tim Cook was very forthright saying we treat everyone in the App Store the same.
Right.
And that's not at all true. If he'd said we treat all apps in the same category the same, you could argue that.
Right.
But just any objective, dispassionate look at the App Store shows that since the beginning, apps have never been treated the same, nor should they be, because there's all different kinds of apps.
But even apps within the same category at times are treated differently depending on the weight of that application.
Those were those were interesting. I think those were rare. Like just from the beginning, like Steve Jobs comes out and he says like no porn, and like you can argue like anything you want about that, but there's just some apps that aren't even allowed on the App Store.
Right.
So you can't say you treat all apps the same. Immediately, we treat all apps on the App Store the same.
Right.
But then we just had this whole kerfuffle about categories of apps, where some categories are allowed reader apps and some aren't. And Apple has a whole list of the categories of apps, and a reader app, it's a really dumb term. It just means that app can provide a front end to a web service, and you don't have to pay Apple. They don't have to pay Apple anything. They can pay, like you can pay Netflix and then have a Netflix reader app to watch your videos on your phone. But not all apps qualify for reader apps. So again, immediately it's not true that they treat all apps the same.
Right. And I think that Tim spoke well, but it was also interesting the way that like his camera focus was kind of like it was fuzzier. He was much quieter, which I think was very, very smart of him. Don't say anything unless you need to say it. Say the bare minimum. And his coloring even was like a little bit less colorful. Like he kind of just like the background and him were very similar to that. So if you don't like, you're not going to really notice him.
Yeah.
Just leave it alone. Stay quiet. Say what you have to say. Don't say anything else. And just, let everyone else kind of take the spotlight.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that specifically because he was almost completely no contrast.
Yes.
Like the opposite of what we're doing here. Like you have light behind you, I have light behind me.
Right.
There's a
See
hair
us.
light.
Yeah. See us. Look at us. Listen to us.
He was almost completely no contrast, no saturation.
Yes.
There's that joke from Brooklyn Nine-Nine where Gina disappears, and at the end she reveals that she wasn't hiding, she was just wearing Amy's clothes.
Right.
And she's like just sitting there in all the scenes, and Amy's like, I feel this is going to be about me. Oh, it's about me. And that's what it was. It was like he did nothing to draw. Was that a smart strategy?
I think that was a brilliant strategy, right? Because when you're going to court or in front of Congress, you don't really want them to pay any attention to you, because then there's very little, like in the end, they can only use what you say against you. It really can't be to your benefit. Your benefit is nothing happens. And so I think that monochrome kind of colorless, quiet speak, being very polite, stating what he was, and disagreeing if he had to, was a brilliant idea, which was almost the stark contrast to Mark Zuckerberg, whose face took up almost the entire screen. It was in high def. It was high def Zuck. And he was right there in
like
front of
knocking
you.
on your head.
Almost, and in a much more combative, but I've actually also found him very straightforward at times way. And he's done this also the most, right?
Yes, he's the most practiced.
So it was kind of like, look at me, see me, and he was right there and a little bit more aggressive much more aggressive than I would say that Tim Cook was.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is like Apple's play here is by saying that they are not a monopoly in any category in which they compete.
Yes.
And all of this is about defining markets.
Right.
Because you can define a market any way you want, and that's part of the game. So if you say like globally, Apple isn't a monopoly because Android has by far the biggest share.
Yes.
But in the US, Apple has roughly just slightly over half the share.
Yes.
But amongst US teens, Apple has much more than half the share.
And in Congress, though, they, we talk about they often mentioned market share and market control, almost trying to veer what antitrust meant to be more about being able to control and dictate what it's saying, which kind of goes against what antitrust is traditionally.
Yeah. Well, that was another huge gripe of mine, that they are. I just to say at the beginning, I believe all these companies need to be regulated. I just don't believe that you can apply existing laws to them, especially not all of them the same laws. Like, I think they need to come up with modern regulations.
Right.
Ben Thompson has done a great job writing about, for example, Facebook and Google as aggregators and how that's traditionally very different. Or that's fundamentally different than like a railroad. And maybe you can apply the railroad things to like the App Store. Maybe that's closer to that situation. But even then, it's specifically creating something just to charge it with a crime, which I think is dicey.
Right.
And why I think they did such a bad job.
Right.
And again,
because these laws have been written way before any of this came into about, so it's not going to make sense, right?
Yeah. No, absolutely. And the App Store, so like the grievances against the App Store. Some of them are like this reader app thing where Hey tried to make an email client and Apple said they couldn't make a reader app for it.
Right.
And there was a whole bunch of back and forth and some really weird rules that Apple made up seemingly after the fact that then Hey jumped through the hoops and managed to do it. but also things like Apple competing against apps. And in some cases, it doesn't matter. Like Apple will tell you in almost every category where they make an app, there are hugely successful indie apps. Like James Thompson makes pCalc. Michael Simmons, Flexibits makes Fantastical.
Right.
Sebastian DeWitt makes Halide with Ben. They're phenomenally good apps in those categories, but Apple is still in those categories.
Yes. But for most of the things that Apple makes a category for, like many of the apps are free or very affordable. And so I think that it's not the same competition in that case. I think that people would be more upset about the control that they can carry about which apps can come in, percentages, than it is really, a competition thing in comparison to Amazon, which is directly competing for money and profit and has been shown to actually bully and pester competitors out of the field. Or the same thing with like Google and the Yelp incident, where Google was directly saying, we're going to take all of your reviews. You don't like it, well then you're not going to be found at all.
Take you off Google.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing here is the EU is floating some legislation where they would not be allowed to install apps by default. And I was joking because obviously it's not going to be all apps. Like I was just joking going, you can't install any apps.
Phone.
Well, how are people going to get them? From the App Store. Oh, but you can't install that either.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And you'd open your phone and be like, what am I going to now do with this phone?
So,
I can't charge it and I can't put on an app.
No. No, totally. But so that's where I think that they often do we talked about this in a previous episode, where you should figure out the solution you want and then design the process to get there, rather than sort of think about these abstract things. Like in abstract, yes, maybe these apps shouldn't be pre-installed, but what is the actual consumer benefit here?
Yes, because let's just say it, like people I wouldn't know what to install, I wouldn't know how to do it, and often you don't, like I'm happy when
you wouldn't know a categoriry of app existed maybe if there wasn't a built-in version.
Or I'm trying to read something and then I don't have a reader application that's on my phone to be able to open I would just be angry, it would be a frustrating experience. So I think that I appreciate that there's a whole bunch of apps that are already installed that might be useful. Like I'm not having a calculator, though, his calculator is great, so you should get pCalc. But anyways, like not having that on your phone at all could be like just a bad experience, and I don't think that that's consumer friendly. I don't think it's a consumer benefit.
My thing is that I think that it should be and this is actually, I'd like your opinion on this because this is tough. There's two schools of thought on this. One is that Apple should be allowed to put these apps, like the basic foundations of the operating system should be on the phone, and the rest, like Pages, things like that, numbers, you should have to go get that from the App Store.
Why though?
Because those are extras. Like you don't need that.
Why is that a benefit to people?
Because you might get Excel instead, or you might get Google Sheets instead. Like you don't like. It's not a basic thing you need to run the phone.
The only piece that I would say to that is that there's so much choice out there that I think that a lot of people will find that experience more frustrating than a benefit. I would much prefer if the apps are there, I could delete them if I want, and I can get another application, which is pretty much, though, some applications you can't delete on certain phones, and I think that
like phone.
Right? Well, that's actually good, because if I did that by mistake, I'd be really upset. But
that's what they're weighing, is like some people do delete them, then they have no idea where their app went.
Exactly.
Like, so,
but I don't think that I don't think that it harms me in any way, shape, or form to have, say, Pages on my phone, and I can use it or not use it if I choose to, but I could download something else if I wished to. That gives me choice,
but some people think you won't download something else because you already have the good enough.
I probably won't because I'm lazy. But
and
again,
that bothers developers.
I probably bought this already because I'm enjoying this ecosystem, or I want this ecosystem.
But that's the danger. See, that's why it's hard. And like the other charge is that Apple should not be allowed to use any APIs, any application programming interfaces that they don't also make available to developers. But the problem there is that some people trust Apple way more than they trust a developer they don't know. So for example, if there's access to some of your data, you may trust an Apple app to access that where you wouldn't trust any app that wants it just to access those things.
Yes, which is true. I do that. I actually
But developers
do feel
sometimes think that's really unfair because they can't do an app that does everything. Like the Clips app, Apple's fun little Clips app that lets you put like weird backgrounds. It doesn't ask for camera permission, but every other app by every developer has to ask you for camera permission.
Right. I think that it would be fair to go the opposite way, where you can say no to, Apple apps for camera permission as well and go through it that way. I would much rather that than have developers have access to my information, because I think that has a greater chance of being misused.
Yeah, and the other point is, I guess the other two big things is different alternate charging methods.
Right.
So, for example, if you don't want to pay with your iTunes account, like with your App Store account,
Right.
I'm so old, I still call it the iTunes account.
That's okay.
If you don't want to pay for your, they would really, and this will bring into the Epic thing in a few minutes, but they want to be able to use their own charging, so they don't have to give Apple 30% of the revenue. And the opposite side of that is it becomes more like one of the benefits of Apple is the trust. Like one of the reasons
Right.
the App Store is so successful is that people trust it absolutely. They're willing to try an app, buy an app, no questions asked. But if you add alternate payment options, it becomes more confusing. Like you don't know which app you have to pay for which way. Like maybe you need a PayPal account for this one, a Stripe account for that one. You have to give your credit card to this app in a third one. And then also if anything goes wrong, like if PayPal has a problem or if a developer charges you directly and your credit card gets skimmed, you lose confidence in the App Store.
Right. Which again, then Apple has to deal with that issue that may not have been there beforehand.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's interesting. Like one of the things I've always said is that there's already an alternative with the Google Play Store, and that the best way to get Apple to change is to make something so good in the Google App Store that the App Store doesn't support. Like if Instagram had only been able to work in the Google Play Store, or if Uber had only been able to work in the Google, like any of the world-changing apps,
Right.
Even if they're just fun world-changing apps, if Google had allowed them and Apple didn't, and the first one for me with this is Xbox Game Pass and
Right.
Google Stadia. Like if those become as popular as Netflix and Google Play allows them and Apple doesn't, I think Apple's going to be forced to change, because people are going to not get iPhones if they're big gamers and they want those things. But otherwise, Google offers not everywhere, not for games, but they offer alternate payment methods.
Right.
And they offer sideloading, which is the other one that some people believe you should be able to sideload apps. Like if China bans VPNs or the US bans TikTok, you should be able to sideload them.
Could you explain just sideloading for those?
So sideloading works like a traditional, this is like the heart of this other huge argument that's going on. When Apple created the App Store, when Steve Jobs first introduced it, he introduced it as an app console, not as a computer. Like it can run apps and games, but it's not a traditional open computing platform. You can't do anything you want with it.
Right.
They wanted absolute control over the environment.
Right.
But on a traditional computer like your Mac, you can go to a website and download an app and install it. You don't have to go through the app. There wasn't an app store until a few years ago.
Right.
So on Android, you can, if you don't want to get something from the Google Play Store, they also have alternate stores. Like if you have a Samsung phone, there might be a Samsung store on it. But also you can download apps arbitrarily. You have to jump through a bunch of hoops and disclaimers, but you can download arbitrary apps and install them.
Right.
So if an app is not on the App Store, you can still get it.
Right. Which is another one of those issues that with Apple,
Yeah.
you can't. You're kind of forced into that. And so that's another one of those issues of should they allow sideloading. But then you do something, it breaks your phone, steals your data.
Yeah.
That's kind of the issue that Apple says, but we make sure that every application has been looked at, it's secure, your privacy is ensured, but does one outweigh the benefits versus the risk and our ability to choose?
And we saw that on Android when things like Pokemon Go first came out and it wasn't available in the US, or when Fortnite decided they weren't going to go onto the Google Play Store. And yes, we'll get to Fortnite in a minute. Very quickly, people put up versions of those apps with malware on them, knowing that some people would download and install them.
Right.
And then they got that malware on it. And you can say, I'm a grown-ass adult, but I think there is a difference. We can argue the line, but there's a difference between computers, which were mostly meant not for normal people. Like they originally came out of universities and government programs, and early punch cards and then command line interfaces blocked almost any normal person from using them. GUIs were a bit easier. Phones are super easy. Like kids from 5 years old to people who never touched a computer and they're in their 80s can use them.
Right.
And the demand for openness versus the safety of the environment, I think, is a legitimate discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's what Apple gets largest hit by people is their controlling nature and how you can't just do anything on the phone. But I think that that's also one of their greatest strengths is that it works really comfortably. It's quite secure.
Yeah.
And you know that when you're going to give it to someone, it's not going to have all of those real issues that you're going to have to be tech support to everyone.
So Epic is one of the biggest cases lately, and they decided they weren't going to pay what they called the Apple tax. And just editor's note: don't ever use the word Apple tax in an article you want me to take seriously. It's such a dumb. It's such a dumb term.
What is the Apple tax?
They
Rene?
claim because Apple asks for a 30% share of the revenue that's an Apple tax, but
is it any different than?
No, it's industry
Android?
standard.
Right.
Like Google will charge it on less things. Like you have more options. But for example, a game like Epic, that's why Epic hates Google too, because they also charge that 30%.
Right.
And they tried sideloading on Android, but they said that Google makes it so hostile because they warn you that you can get malware that it's not practical. Epic is a special case though, but yeah, so they put their own alternate payment process in there, and Apple and Google banned them from the store. And they keep going to court to try to get injunctions and force their way back on. And the judge in the case is so smart. She is so smart. She sees through all of the nonsense, like from all of the lawyers. She's just like, nope, that's not how it. She knows exactly how it works. Why do they try?
Because Epic kind of went in saying that we're fighting for the little guy.
Yes.
We're fighting for developers.
Yes.
This is a walled garden. It isn't fair.
Yes.
And so they kind of went out with this hope that they would be looking like a shining knight going to rescue everyone. And yet the judge kind of shut that down, saying, you know what, like...
You're not the victim here.
Right. You knew the rules.
Yep.
You read everything. And... You know, we talk a lot about how like privacy, all the rules, they're really like, it's hard to read through them. They're difficult. But Epic has tons of lawyers that they pay a lot of money that know exactly how to do it because they write the same kind of rules and apply the same type of fees to their own service, which they're fine about. They don't say, oh, we were wrong too. We're not going to have everyone else charged for other things that they're buying through us.
Yeah. No, it's hilarious to me. And what just happened, I think yesterday, it might have been the day before, depending on when you're watching this, was she slapped them around so hard during the trial. They got to the second part, and the actual lawyer from Epic said the quiet part out loud. He's like, well, I was not really successful in the first part, but I'm going to keep going. And I was like, oh, why would you say that?
Giving up, I know.
Yeah. But so basically reasserted what I think was fair. I think most people thought was fair is that Apple can't cancel all their licenses, so they can't get rid of the Unreal Engine on the Mac. But she's not going to force.
Apple can't be punitive against this. She's kind of like, don't be punitive.
Yeah.
But
like, don't overreach.
But you also have to make sure that if you sign a contract, you have to follow the contract of which you were signed.
She said that you can reverse your own harm. You can get back on the App Store anytime. And Apple kept saying that. And interestingly, I know we're jumping around a bit, but interestingly, both the judge and Apple said that they could put the game back on the store and hold the money in escrow until the final decision. And Epic was like, nope, not going to do it. And then so who's really on the side of the players here?
Right. Well, and that pretty much shows the answer to it, that this really is about money and the bottom line. And, you know, the game is so big, I think that they were thinking that people would be really angry and because of that would kind of have an uproar. But the case was seen through very, very quickly. And
they were like so mature about it too, by making like a 1984 ad and making a caricature of Tim Cook in the game. And it's one of those things where I think sometimes a powerful, charismatic CEO like Tim Sweeney for Epic, even Steve Jobs, because he got involved in all sorts of stock backdating and no competition, conspiracy, like things that did get Apple slapped around legally. I think they sometimes just want what they want. And to me, this feels like Tim Sweeney just wants what he wants, and doesn't really care about the clients, like, because they have clients for the Epic Unreal Engine. Like, people use that to make games and doesn't care about the customers in the end. I think he just wants what he wants.
Yeah, which is like fair. I think that every company kind of wants to get as much as they can from it.
I think if you're not a founder, you don't get away with that behavior.
I think if you're popular enough, sometimes people do. Maybe. They'll give you a little bit of an allocation because we love you, so we're going to look past this. Yeah. But I think that when people looked at the fact that there was like a hypocritical aspect to what they were stating and it was known, right? They're going to be charging.
I just mean internal pushback. Or maybe it's just because he owns so much of Epic, everything that Tencent doesn't own, but or Sony doesn't own. But with Facebook, which we'll get to in our second topic, Mark Zuckerberg built it so that he could sell shares, make money, but not give up control. And there's literally no control on him. Where like Tim Cook has way more controls on him at Apple because he's subject to the board and the shareholders. So I guess ultimately it's unclear to me where we go from here, like what the regulation is. I think Apple would be well advised to get ahead of this to avoid, especially like the EU getting involved,
right?
Because they can screw up any technology company. and do things like I don't know if they should allow side loading. I don't know if they should allow alternate payments, but they should investigate it. And I think the most important thing, the critical thing is they should stop making own goals. Like to me, the whole hey email thing was an own goal. And when they removed the developer certificate incorrectly a few weeks ago, that was an own goal. Just every time they do something that hurt the developer and gets negative attention, it makes the likelihood of regulation higher. And they should avoid that at all costs.
So if Apple states that they're working on it, does an internal review, do you think that that would be enough to appease at least the US Congress?
Yeah, and I think developers in general are fine with the 30%. I think the 30% thing has just been completely overblown by a few sensationalists, I think, especially in social media. You can quibble that it should be lower, and that's fine. It probably should be lower. The App Store now is not 10 years ago. 10 years ago it was brand new, but it's what Google charges, it's what Xbox charges. And you could say it's a collusion, it's a cartel, it's an oligopoly, but I've never seen any proof of that. I've never seen any proof that they had talked to each other and said that this was the price they were going to charge. And they're not making excessive profits over it. They're profitable. And you could argue they should run at no profit because they're the platform owner. I would entertain that argument.
But then it would have to be across the board as well.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And companies are there to make profit. Yeah. And so it becomes this really difficult. Being an industry standard, being the fact that other companies are doing it for whichever reason, makes it really hard to argue that Apple's doing something wrong in comparison to all of them are doing something wrong. Versus them just saying, well, this seems to be what's fair. Other people find it fair. So we're going along with what we think is a fair amount.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I would just make sure that there's never, as much as possible, there's never a situation where anyone believes that they're. I think it comes down to you can't get away with the same behavior when they're this big. One of the problems, and we'll get to this in the second topic, but one of the biggest problems with this is it felt like the Congress was litigating problems from the last decade. Even a lot of the emails they brought up were years old. They were Steve Jobs emails.
Right.
And Steve Jobs hasn't run Apple since 2011. Even then, he resigned as CEO in 2010. Maybe it was 2011, but that's not this era. Right. And Eddie Q is still actively involved. But when you have a really big partner, you let them get away with more than a little partner. That's how all businesses work. Right. If I have a sponsor that says, we'll pay you $10 million for the next 2 years, they move to the front of the line. I love all my sponsors equally, but
if that one maybe a little bit more.
If you're if Walmart suddenly wants you on the shelves, or you suddenly get a huge movie deal, that's just how business works. It's only problematic when you're that big. And I think Apple went from being such an underdog to being so successful and never stopped to think if they could get away with the same sort of rock and roll negotiation style that they had. So where would you like to see, just as a customer, where would you like to see this part end, just for Apple?
I think that it's really difficult because I think that if Apple made a gesture of goodwill, right, I think that would go a really long way. Lowered their percentage just so that they were underneath what Google was charging, if they just did that, I think that would go huge. But I think that I understand Apple's also their shareholders and what they're making is a huge deal, and if they make any changes, they sneeze, their stock prices go down. And so that's my other piece to it, is that how much does this damage Apple as a company? But even if they lowered it to 28, it's 2% difference. Again, but 2% at Apple's numbers is a huge amount of money. And so, it does giving a good sign of good faith to be able to be helpful, or apps that make under a certain amount don't have to until they're profitable to this certain percentage. I think that would probably very minimally affect Apple, but I think that for small developers, I think that it would be a really big deal because they'd be able to, first start up and become profitable, and then after that, then they could start paying their way just like everyone else did, because there are a lot of struggling developers. And now that the App Store is so large, even just being seen and having your app heard about is a really difficult time.
Yeah, I have this thing, and I think we've talked about it before, where I actually don't think that Apple and the App Store are the problem. I think there are problems with it, and I think that Apple, whether or not it's regulated, I think there's things Apple should change. I don't think it'll change anything for developers, just because I think apps are becoming pop culture the way that movies and TV shows. Like people used to buy CDs, and now you get all your music for $10.
Right.
And people used to buy video games. Like you remember, video games were like $60. They still are $60, and
yeah.
now it's $10 a month for Game Pass.
Exactly.
Like there's just that money is being taken out, and it's not coming back. But I even think, like I personally think that they should allow sideloading using Gatekeeper, like on the Mac. But I don't think it'll solve the problem people think it will. Like people are like, well, then we can install VPN apps. Then if the US bans TikTok, we could still install it. And maybe for a very few apps. But China's going to ban the servers. America's going to ban the servers. You're going to have a side-loaded app that doesn't connect to anything. And maybe like the very nerdy people will figure that out.
Right.
But the non-nerdy people will download TikTok unlocked and just get malware.
Right.
So like, I think we have got to come to grips with the changing of the market and changing of the world, and that we don't buy wooden toys anymore. We buy, factory-made plastic toys now.
Right. But on the other side of companies that are doing things that are illegal,
Yeah.
And get caught for that, that's a complete different story. And I think that is something that needs to be heavily regulated. And I think that we've mentioned this now a couple times. I don't know if it's even on the ones that we have. But like regulations that carry sentences instead of just regulations that are small slaps on the wrist economically that don't really affect the company, even if they were percentage amounts instead of number amounts, which seem really big, but to the companies, they're like, a nickel in their pockets.
Yeah, it's like that gets into the other three companies, our second topic, which because they also had it on their report on them. And again, I'm disappointed because there are so many problems here, and I don't think they're addressing them. I think they're again trying to fit them into their cookie cutter mold, like Amazon. And I'm deeply conflicted because I love Amazon's service, but it makes me feel so like such a bad human being for using it.
They give such a great service, and the refunds are great. Like they treat their people, their customers wonderfully well. I've almost never had a bad interaction with Amazon where they have not made sure that I was taken care of.
Same.
And so I use it, especially now when I don't leave. But then I feel bad about it because I know that Amazon is not the most loving company to the people that are on Amazon and to their workers.
Yeah. And so, absolutely. Like they treat their warehouse workers abysmally, like reprehensibly. And they move into places, they get huge tax. Like people complain that Jeff Bezos doesn't pay enough taxes. I'm complaining that they give him so many tax breaks. Like, pick one. Like fine. Be upset that Amazon doesn't pay enough taxes. Stop giving them tax breaks. You'll have a lot more money. But beyond that, one of the things that the report raised was their house brands. So, for example, Amazon got into basics. You can buy the Amazon Basic Power Bar, the Amazon Basic Diaper, like all these categories. They're competing with their own partners. And Amazon argues that this is not unusual, that Walmart has their own brand, that President's Choice is a house brand, for example.
Yeah.
And that's true. The report argues that because Amazon has access to much better data, that it's different. I don't believe that's true.
No.
One of my old jobs was in data analytics, and we helped run the data analytics for some of the biggest food retailers in the world.
Right.
And they all knew exactly what was selling. And not only did they know who was buying Coke instead of Pepsi, they would turn around and sell that data back to Coke and Pepsi, both their own data, the competing data, and the ancillary data, like who's buying what potato chip with you, and do you want to pay extra to be on the shelf next to that chip?
And I don't know if it's fair to ask, and you could say it's wrong, but I don't think that any company, if you have access to that information, would choose not to use it to become more profitable, right? But then also, no company can properly or they could effectively if it was in their benefit, but no company wants to police themselves. They're going to do what they can not to get caught. So the police themselves so they don't get caught, don't get something that's so illegal that they'll be sanctioned for. But how do you, if you have that information at your fingertips, it's almost like you're doing a bad job as a company if you're not really using all the analytics that you have. Well, and for the company's profitability itself, because that's what their main goal is to become the most profitable and to make sure that no one else can become more profitable than you and you can take more of their profits for yourself.
Yeah, so I think their remedy here is saying that maybe Amazon shouldn't be allowed to have house brands, that you should have to choose to be the store or the products being sold at the store.
But then wouldn't they have to do that with all other grocery stores?
Only when you get to a certain size, because again, like the antitrust kicks in when you have disproportionate control over a marketplace.
Fair. So then Walmart, would that be, like, at what number are you going to
That's
give
the
it?
question.
And then you've already have your brand. People have maybe known it, trusted it, loved it. And then now you have to stop production,
Well,
and
and
all those
also-
people that are working have to become out of work because
also,
your
like-
size grows.
Like these brands don't come out of nowhere. Like often they're made by the same people who make the regular brands.
Yes.
They're just made in bulk and with no packaging and sell lower. So we don't actually know how much, like Amazon brand toothpaste might be made by like a Colgate. Like it probably isn't. I have no idea. I haven't even looked into this. I'm just saying it because of the podcast.
Don't quote us.
But like Amazon toothpaste might be made by Colgate, and we don't know how much money Colgate makes from that versus how much they make. Like I'm guessing they make more from their name brand, but maybe Amazon buys like a ton of it from them. I don't have these numbers,
Right.
and I didn't see them in the report.
Right. Versus when they're specifically targeting a brand, such as in the diaper issue, they're choosing to target them, choosing to undercut them, and there's a paper trail where they're trying to gut them. That seems to go more into that gray, this probably
Or
shouldn't
black,
be
or
allowed.
evil, yeah.
Right? Because this is a targeting. But then the other side to that is, but isn't that what everyday meetings go between Coke and Pepsi and, no name brand this and something else?
Well, I think the charge here is that it's unfair because Amazon is so big, and because of the wide range of data they have, they can pick and choose which products to do in a way that no like consumer packaged good company can. They have to invest money in testing and putting these things out there, but Amazon can just look at all the stuff they're testing and say, oh, this makes the most money, we're going to do this.
And because they're so large, they can sell them on purpose to bankrupt.
They can
another
price
company.
them just enough to make more money. They can place them on the web page in a better position to make, which brings us to Google too. And you mentioned this earlier, where Google will copy Yelp's results, put their own results on top of Yelp, and then if Yelp complains, threaten to take Yelp off Google.
Right.
They have an
And
advantage that the individual
that
doesn't.
to me seems like it's a much more direct. They're using their own platform to be able to control and misuse the information they have in order to now, like 89% of the search results go through Google.
Yeah.
Like that one's a really hard argument to say that there is any competition. Like I try to use DuckDuckGo, I really do.
Yeah, same.
But it's hard. It's not on everything because, it's good enough.
The thing to me is like, I get a lot of pushback for being super critical of Google, but to me, Google is the most important company in the world because they're building the Star Trek computer. Like Apple makes wonderful phones, Amazon delivers my stuff, Facebook is hugely problematic, but Google to me feels like they're building the future. Like if we're going to get to Star Trek, Google's going to be the big part of getting there.
Right.
And that to me means that they need a level of scrutiny unlike any company in the world.
Right.
But at the same time, they enjoy this reality distortion field that is 10 times Steve Jobs at his highest. Like you have granola crunching, neck bearded, open source advocates fighting for Google because Google says the words open source when they are just as proprietary, just as controlling, even worse in some ways over like you can't get like, yes, you can get Chromium's open source. You can't get Google search open source, AdSense open source. Every company tries to protect what makes them money and open source what makes other companies money to hurt them.
Yes, exactly.
And Google's great at that. Like even since Eric Schmidt is like, well, you can change your name after high school if you want privacy,
Right.
It is and in the report, it's if you look through it, Google is the most sinister, calculating, cold-blooded company when it comes to all of this. Like how they've handled it over the years to try to minimize their exposure to antitrust. It is Machiavellian.
Yes.
And we saw like anything they want to build. We saw this with like Skyhook. They'll or with Google Maps, they'll partner with somebody to take everything that company has. It's like Microsoft, but like the Borg version.
Right.
Take everything they have, duplicate it, then dump the person, and it just happens over and over again.
Right. And they went to Congress and actually said then when they acquired a company that was going to be able to get rid of kind of the anonymity that we have when we go through search, they specifically said we are not going to use this. We can't, even if we wanted to, be able to know who is the person behind all of the clicks. Then they bought the company. Congress said, oh, okay, we believe you because you said that. And then, 2 years later, now there's no anonymity through the internet. They know who it is, the direct person that is making which clicks. And when called about it, it was kind of like, well, I don't really remember that. Did we do that?
Yeah.
So it's a big deal.
Yeah, and it's totally irrelevant to this, but it also disturbs me the amount of harassment and other claims relating to Google executives were just completely brushed aside, paid off, moved aside, and still, as far as I can tell, nobody's been held accountable for any of that stuff. And that's doesn't directly relate to this, but it does in terms of how I think the management behaves. Like I think Sundar Pichai is wonderful, but I think he smiles while a lot of really troublesome things happen. And again, like Android, I have to be careful here because I have such distaste for Andy Rubin at this point, but he hasn't been involved for a while. But Android still, like, even whenever they talk about privacy, it's privacy involving developers, not them. Like, right. Android still tracks you at a level that's incomprehensible almost. And the government's report, like it's unclear to me how they want to control Google either. Google gets away with a lot of stuff that we get angry at Facebook for. Like, for some reason, we just don't get as angry at Google. Maybe because we think, like, oh, they keep failing. Like, Google Plus didn't work. Or they keep canceling stuff. It's so cute. Like, they have this Keystone Cops, oh, shucks, we messed up something else facade.
Right.
But underneath, it's, like, super successful at getting everything they really want.
Yes. And I think that we've become accustomed to it, right? We use it all the time, so we become accustomed to that. And they get caught. It does not really make the same press that Facebook does. Facebook takes a lot of hate, some of which I think is very, very valid. But Google does not really get called out for it at the same levels.
And it's hard to say what the remedy is here. Like, should Google already split themselves up into Alphabet? Was that a map for how the government should split them up?
But what even would that change?
I don't know.
Like, does splitting up a company, it doesn't mean that they cannot they're not supposed to give information back and forth, but how would you really know?
I think what it looks like is sort of GDPR-style privacy regulation being enforced. And GDPR isn't great because it puts a burden on smaller companies that big companies can afford to just pay their way through. So it's not perfect. But I do think, going back to what we talked about before, holding executives liable for crimes committed on data as if they were physical objects would go a long way towards suppressing the worst impulses of these companies.
Right. And if they, misuse things or they go against what, they say to Congress, which is supposed to be a crime in the first place. Lying to Congress is supposed to be a crime.
Oh, they didn't know. They don't pay attention to the companies. They're not sure what's happened. They'll get back to you. Do I even run Amazon?
Yeah, let's just, like, they have the...
Am I that Jeff Bezos?
It was the other Jeff Bezos. Did I really do it? But if there's a paper trail that actually leads back and it's knowledgeable, I think that should be an actionable fact.
Yep. And Facebook, again, Facebook is hugely problematic. It's like, depending on where you fall on it, it's either done the most to bring the human race together more than anything else, or it's done the most to tear us apart more than anything else. Like you said, Zuckerberg has been there before. He's got the T-shirt. He's done this over and over again.
Right.
He is absolutely fine with breaking any rule, being yelled at, and then just breaking the next rule so you forgot about the first rule.
Yes, exactly.
He broke.
Saying, oh, I'm so sorry, did I do that?
Well, he's doing the next thing.
Exactly.
And they were split on this, and I think it's really unfortunate because there's this huge divide in American politics that makes it very easy for bad behavior to slip in between. And on one side, you had a bunch of Democrats who are trying to misapply outdated antitrust. And on the other side, you have a bunch of Republicans who are trying to complain that they unfairly target conservative thinking, when it's not clear to me that any of the Republicans on there are actually conservative. Like, none of them are yelling about balancing the budget or paying down debt. And if you look at Facebook, like, this isn't a question. You look at Facebook any day, you can see the most popular articles, and they're not being suppressed, and they're mostly cockamamie conspiracy theories that these Congress people were complaining about. Like, it's just their desire to pander to a very small, loud minority of people for political, shameless political gain really does a disservice to regulating these incredibly harmful companies that have literally gotten people killed.
And the thing is that when you control the media, you do control the message. And so I think that because this is so politicized, it's the people that lose out. It's our privacy, our information. And if you see something enough times in media, for anything, you say something enough times, you begin to believe that it's true.
But we're too busy hating each other. We want them to play these games. These games come from us.
Yes. Well, and you click it. We click those links. And we
buy the National
justify
Enquirer.
it, and we justify bad behavior because it's our guy's bad behavior, not those guys' bad behavior. And so then we become more and more split when really, in order to deal with these issues, that are a detriment to our society, right? And there have been Facebook executives and executives to other companies that have actually quit because they believe that they have specifically stated that they feel that they were destroying the fabrics of society.
Yes.
Now, so just think about that. You have a job, you want to get a job in the same field. Coming out and specifically saying that about a very large company has huge repercussions. There is no benefit to fame to say that. You really have to believe that to not just quit, but then to publicly come out and state that.
And not just one person, like multiple people over the last few years. And again, it's unclear to me they understand the problem because they were complaining about Facebook having a monopoly on social networking. And again, Ben Thompson did a great job pointing out that they don't, because this is not a physical good. Like, this is not the cable company where you only have one cable company in your city. You can click between Facebook and previously Google+, but now still Twitter and a bunch of other things. Like, and this is what Google argues. Google says, competition is just one mouse click away or one, tap of the screen away. And theoretically, yes. Practically, no, because they have their tendrils throughout the web. And they also focused on the Instagram acquisition, where it probably should never have been allowed, but it seems like such a small part of the problem at this point.
Right.
It's like if there's the same owner for two stores and you get into an argument over the price on an item, you say, I'll show you, I'll go across the street to the other store, but it's the same owner, they're laughing.
Yeah.
And yes, that's a problem, but the problem to me, it goes back to this whole TikTok thing with the US wanting to ban TikTok. TikTok is a company. You should never ban a company. You should ban the behavior of any company in that industry that is problematic.
Which actually causes change.
Yes.
Right.
So totally unclear to me that anyone is using this beyond a political talking point.
Or that any real change is really going to happen from anything. Are they going to make widespread regulations to make sure that consumers are safe? Or are they just doing this kind of to use this as a loudspeaker towards their own constituents?
Yeah, I fear that's true. I fear that you have on one hand people yelling, suppression of free speech, which just shows that these people have no concept of what they know they don't care, and that should be terrifying. They don't care
unless it's their free speech, and that's what bothers me. Is that if it's my free speech, I want it to be heard. If it's someone else's free speech, I would like it to be suppressed.
That's the part that scared me. The part that scared me the most is that almost every single one of those Congress people had moments of utter clarity and precision of prosecution in this, where they elaborated on their case perfectly. Like, they were like a really good lawyer. And then the other 90% of the time, they said things so outlandish that they had to be performing for the cameras. And it disgusts me on a deep personal level that we allow them to act like circus clowns, because that is what we want, rather than act like prosecutors, which is what we need.
Right.
Like, they will say abhorrent things and then flip a switch and be needle sharp, and that's the real them. They're pretending to be the clown for the camera, and that really offends me. All right, so I would love to know where you fall on this, both, for Apple, for Amazon, for Facebook, for Google.
And what would you do to fix this? Or do you even think that it should be solved? Or, should this just remain kind of this Wild West and, let the strongest survive?
What would be your ideal remedy? What would make these companies better for you? I guess that's the bottom line, because that's what should be the concern, is not you personally, but you as a family, a society. What would make it better for you? Right. So we do have our extra bonus topics coming up on Nebula. If you're subscribed to Nebula, you'll get
something very interesting too.
Oh, God.
It's experiential.
Oh God. Okay. All right. I am not afraid. I will embrace fear. But In the meantime, Georgia, where can people find you?
So if you're dealing with anxiety or depression, you can check out anxiety-videos.com. You could send me an email, georgia@westmounttherapy.com. And
Wow.
I'm on, I'm on, everyone always questions that. No,
Yeah.
it's always been nice. And I'm on Twitter, Georgia_Dow.
And you can find me at Rene Ritchie on every one of these. I stopped using Facebook completely. I can just blew it out
You
of
really
everything.
have done
Yeah.
a good job. I'm very
Not
proud.
Instagram still.
No way.
No, I use it less, but I still, it's hard. Quitting Instagram is hard. I quit Facebook Messenger. Even people who said like, it's the only way I have to contact you. I'm like, sorry, better learn how to use SMS. But
We get all these direct messages then. Give me your
but yeah,
phone
you
number.
can find me at Twitter at Rene Ritchie and on YouTube, youtube.com/Rene Ritchie, where I did 7 videos last week, Georgia,
Yeah, and you
including
can-
the last podcast, 7
You
videos.
did amazing.
No,
You did
that's too
amazing.
many.
Plus, the Apple event is probably, if you're watching this later, it's already happened. So you're going to have
That's
like
why we didn't
probably-
talk about it.
We didn't talk about it because
It'll have already happened.
it'll already happened. Whatever we're going to say now has already been said so many times. And
It's
you'll
the
already
future,
know.
Marty. It's a paradox.
So hopefully you've already seen it, or this is Monday. Then
We'll
you
go
know,
over it next week.
We'll go over
Yeah.
it and discuss all of the stuff afterwards. But please hit subscribe.
Leave a
Send other
review,
people-
leave a
like
rating.
those,
If you're on Apple
please.
Podcasts, Georgia would love to read them. She does. She reads them.
I do. I read them.
Yeah.
I get
Yeah.
excited. Someone replied.
And again, stay tuned for our bonus topics on Nebula. And if you don't have a Nebula subscription yet, you can just go to, curiositystream.com/AppleTalk. I think we have our own link now.
Oh, nice.
curiositystream.com/AppleTalk and sign up, and then you get Curiosity Stream and you get Nebula, and it's the best deal in streaming. Awesome.